Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the delay while we played with our new technology up here in front. So fáilte of Clare, Sibse an Seo Sahala, agus everyone ag féach an Doran or YouTube, and those who'll be watching the YouTube back later. This is our second lecture of the 2024-25 season. We're very pleased to have Mary Alice Wildasin, who some of you will know, even though when she opens her mouth, you'll know she's not a Clare woman. She's living in Malacca, originally from Maine and Florida with roots in Canada, has been studying genealogy and local history for many years, has an MA in history as a family with a dissertation on her own family, the Dorans from Summerslane, Kilkenny to Bangor, Maine, a case study in step migration from the University of Limerick. And she's going to talk to us tonight about migration to Quebec from 1845 to 1860. So please give Mary Alice a big welcome.
Thank you and good evening. Tonight's presentation is based on Chapter 2 of my dissertation, as Patty just told you the title of, The Dorans from Summerslane, Kilkenny to Bangor, Maine, 1820 to 1900, a case study in steppe migration. My ancestors from just outside of Callan first migrated to Quebec, then two brothers continued their migration to Bangor, Maine. Angorta Mór, or the Great Hunger, affected the island of Ireland from 1845 to 1852. It was undoubtedly one of the worst human catastrophes of the 19th century. During those years, an estimated 2.1 million Irish, or 1/4 of Ireland's pre-famine population, left the country, with a further 1 million Irish who died. My presentation is not lining up. I'm way off here. For the most part, history tells us that the Irish abandoned their homeland because of famine, political strife, epidemics, religious suppression, and evictions. They desired a better life for themselves and their families. Some of the benefits of Quebec City to Irish immigrants were transportation to Canada was relatively inexpensive and readily available. Quebec was a French Catholic city. There was already an established Irish community there, and work was relatively easy to obtain as there were many laboring positions in timber and shipping. Christine Keneally writes that between 1841 and 1851, Ireland's population dropped by 1,649,330 people, with 1,289,133 of them migrating. Donald Akinson states that between 1841 and 1851, 822,675 people emigrated to the U.S., and 329,321 emigrated to Canada. The most inexpensive fares were to Canada, as it too was a British colony, at approximately 5 shillings, whereas to the United States, fares ran upwards to £5. In 1849 or 50, the Dorans, like so many Irish, chose to emigrate. Likely this was due to the effects of the famine, but the exact reason may never be known. Life would have been very difficult in rural Ireland during the Great Famine, and the thought of starting a new life in Canada may have been appealing. There were certain migration schemes to assist migrants in their journey, such as the Earl Grey and the Strokestown Park Estate schemes. There is no evidence that the Doran's landlords, the Orphans of Kilkenny, provided any such assistance to their tenants, nor is there any evidence that they did not aid in migration. Here are examples of advertisements that potential migrants might have seen to entice them on a voyage to Quebec. One informs of a departure from Belfast, the other from Waterford. The migration to Canada was up to 8 weeks and often deadly from disease or shipwreck. Another ad for passage between Dublin and Quebec. This states the provisions each traveler will receive with their ticket. Each passenger will be supplied with 10.5 pounds of breadstuffs, 2 ounces of tea, and 1 pound of sugar weekly, with a supply of fuel, water, and medicines during the voyage, free of expense. In a letter dated June 27, 1849, Jane White writes to Eleanor Wallace of her travels, "On our long, tedious journey, we have had fever and smallpox on board. We have had many fearful days in our long voyage. It is 8 weeks since we embarked in Belfast Lough." Quebec City in the province of Quebec sits on the St. Lawrence River and was a major trading port for Canada. Quebec was a deep water port, so it allowed many ships to dock. As they could not go any further up the St. Lawrence, Quebec became a major maritime port for goods going to other areas such as Montreal, Toronto, and Ontario. Due to its proximity to the United States, many migrants to Quebec ended up in bordering states such as Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. With the decline of the fur trade in the 18th century, timber exporting became a leading economic industry in the 19th century, with many shiploads destined for the British Isles. Migration from England, Scotland, and Ireland to Canada was quite easy in that one could get a return ship once a timber ship was offloaded. Shipping companies decided instead of returning an empty ship, they would earn a bit of extra money returning with a shipload of immigrants. Due to the timber demand, a market was created for shipbuilding. Quebec City, which had 7 shipyards employing 1,338 people in 1851, was a major shipbuilding port in the Canadas. Ships returning to Canada with migrants seemed to solve a problem for the British landlords in Ireland, with the gradual removal of surplus population or sources of unrest, and the ship owners benefited with the new market from paying passengers. Sorry, that just went back on me. A newspaper ad for arriving building supplies from Quebec. Every type of vessel already engaged in the timber trade out of Quebec could offer as an immigrant ship. It was mainly these vessels, the timber ships, that carried the major part of the immigrants to Quebec. In the 19th century, an increasing stream of people were leaving Europe to rebuild their lives in North America. Around 1830, an average of 30,000 immigrants arrived annually in the city of Quebec, the main port of entry to Canada. Approximately 2/3 of these newcomers were from Ireland. This unprecedented immigration on the St. Lawrence River took place at a time when major cholera and smallpox epidemics were sweeping through Europe. To help control the spread of the disease, the quarantine station at Gros Isle, located in the St. Lawrence River upstream from the city of Quebec, was established in 1832 and operated until its closure in 1937. In 1847, over 100,000 people traveled to Gros Isle fleeing the famine. The first ships docked with 241 passengers on board. 84 were sick with fever and 9 were dead. In the same year, over 5,000 Irish perished at sea on board ships bound for Canada. The impact of this wave of Irish immigration on Canada's population was huge, with those arriving on board coffin ships, often sick and dying, which adversely affected Canada's port towns. By June of 1847, the port of Quebec became so overwhelmed that dozens of ships carrying over 14,000 Irish queued for days to make a landing. The Reverend Brother Memorian Sheehy wrote, "Black 47, as the year is known, was a nightmare for immigrants migrating to Canada. The steamships that were carrying the Irish became known as coffin ships, as so many were dying on board during the passage. Grosse Ile Immigration Cemetery received the remains of 10,000 who sought a home and found naught but a nameless grave. It is thought to be the largest Irish burial ground outside of Ireland." I have been here, and it is a haunting place. This is a 1970s painting by Rodney Sharman, his interpretation of the inside of a coffin ship. It would not have been a pleasant trip. Diseases of epic proportion were not new to the city of Quebec. In 1659, typhus had appeared on a migrant ship from France, the Saint Andre, carrying 130 immigrants. 10 died along the way, and once landed in Quebec, the disease spread among the residents, and a number of people died. In 1832, there was a cholera epidemic, although it is not known as to which ship was the source. 51,746 immigrants were processed at Grosse Ile of 62,000 total immigrants from Ireland and England that year. The epidemic spread to Quebec and Montreal. The exact death toll is uncertain. In 1847, the nightmare began again with outbreaks of cholera and typhus on the migrant ships arriving from Europe. Also known as ship's fever, as it thrived in unsanitary conditions, such as migrant ships, 441 ships processed at Grosse Ile that year, 2,200 corpses carried off ships, 5,424 died at Grosse Ile, over 5,000 died at sea, and people who died on board a vessel greater than 30 kilometers from the quarantine station were thrown overboard. The Belfast Newsletter on the 3rd of August, 1849 states, "The cholera had decreased in New York, however, had increased in Montreal, Quebec, and Toronto." The Irish Examiner printed on the 13th of August of that year, "In Montreal and Quebec, accounts maintained that the deadly scourge was fearfully fatal. In Quebec, the number of deaths was 61, and a complete panic exists." Immigrants to North America arriving from 1847 into the early 1850s would encounter these diseases in some way. One reason it seems that the Irish Catholics went to Quebec is because it was already an established Catholic city. According to Atkinson, directly related to the Irish is the fact that at the time of the American independence, none of the 13 American colonies granted Roman Catholics full and equal rights. Indeed, until the last quarter of the 19th century, some states still did not do so. In contrast, in 1774, Catholics were given full civil rights under the Quebec Act. The Irish commenced migration to Quebec in large numbers around 1813, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Upon arriving in Quebec, the Irish Catholics had no English-speaking church to attend, only French. From 1822, they attended Notre Dame Cathedral Basilica of Quebec. The Irish attended Mass at 8 a.m., then the French attended at 9 a.m. In 1828, the Irish started attending Our Lady of Victories of Lowertown, Quebec. As the Irish population expanded, so did those attending Sunday Mass. They very quickly outgrew the sanctuary, with 6,000 to 7,000 mass-goers attending each Mass, often with many standing in the market outside the church. Given the considerable new English-speaking Catholics in the city, the need for an English-speaking Catholic church was demanded. In 1832, St. Patrick's Church was built. However, it was not acknowledged as an English-speaking sanctuary until 1853, when it was formally recognized by the Congregation of the Catholics of Quebec. Margaret Conrad states that the Anglicization of the northern half of North America in this period, owing largely to immigration from Great Britain, is one of the most significant developments in the history of the British empires. The historiography of Irish immigrants to Canada has focused largely on the Irish Protestants that migrated early in the 19th century. The Irish Catholic migrants from 1813 to 1871 have been grouped with the Protestants as one group of Irish migrants. The Irish Catholics mostly stayed within the confines of Quebec City, whereas the Protestants were living in other areas such as Ontario, Hamilton, and New Brunswick, and were primarily farming. Table 1 illustrates the number of Irish-born immigrants to Quebec separated by religion. The Irish Catholics are an understudied class and deserve their own historiography. Much of the current research has been done by Robert Grace. Progressively more Catholics of more humble status from the west and south of the island began emigrating in numbers from around 1835. By the 1840s, the vast majority of immigrants were Catholic, unskilled laborers and domestic servants. Before 1833, there were no English-speaking Catholic churches in Quebec City, even though most of its residents worshipped in the Roman Catholic faith. With an influx of Irish Catholic immigrants in the early 19th century, who mostly spoke English, a group of Irish, headed by the Reverend Patrick McMahon, the future pastor of St. Patrick's, started a committee to build the first English-speaking Catholic church in Quebec. They built the church, and in so doing, they also established themselves as a specific group of Catholics, differing in language and culture from the French-Canadian comrades, having different needs but expecting to have them filled by the one source, the church and its bishop. In 1831, land was purchased on St. Helene Street from donations, and ground was broken for the structure. It was planned that on June 11, 1832, a commemoration would be held for the laying of the cornerstone. However, an outbreak of cholera on June 8th disrupted both the public and private life of the city and its tragedy. Construction was resumed and the cornerstone was laid later that year. The dedication of St. Patrick's Church was held in July of 1833, establishing one of the first ethnic parishes in the entirety of Canada. The church was within 1 mile of Notre Dame Church in the Upper City. However, it would be a meeting place for the English-speaking Irish immigrants who lived in the Champlain ward of Quebec in Lower City. Quebec was founded by Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer, in 1608 and is built on a plateau. The city was made up of 2 distinct areas, Lower Town and Upper Town. Lower Town is level with the St. Lawrence River and separated from Upper Town by a line of steep cliffs, which you can see here. This is a photograph of Champlain Street from 1865. During the process of migrating from Ireland, many children became orphaned, as many parents did not survive the journey to North America on the coffin ships. Large numbers of people died from starvation, not unlike what was happening back in Ireland. Others succumbed to typhus. The term orphaned did not refer solely to children whose parents had died. In fact, many orphans had a living parent who was sick, who did not have enough money to care for them, who worked as a live-in domestic, who had abandoned them, who lived somewhere else in North America, or who had remained in Ireland. Many orphaned Irish children were taken in by French Canadians, often through the assistance of the church. Many children went into an orphanage founded by the affluent Quebec women called the Charitable Society of Catholic Ladies of Quebec, later run by the Grey Nuns from 1849. The orphanage kept quite extensive records of many of the children under their charge. Information included the child's name, age, parent's name, including mother's maiden name, parish and county, ship's name were entered where such information was available. Notes on the children were kept into the 1860s, illustrating the interest of the nuns in their former command. The church was quite insistent that once children were adopted, that they take their new parents' French surnames in order to help assimilate to their new culture. However, one little girl said that her mother had requested that she keep her Irish name as a remembrance of her family and her heritage. This was agreed to by the adoptive mother. From that point forward, it was commonplace for the orphans to keep their given names and identities. This created quite a camaraderie between the Irish and the French Canadians. This presentation has argued that immigrants from Ireland were likely to be attracted to Quebec as a destination because the transport links were accessible and inexpensive. They were further encouraged in the 1840s and 50s by the fact that an Irish Catholic community had been established there since the early years of the 19th century and was reaching a size at which could offer significant support. Case study, looking at the Dorans. The Doran family of Summerslane, Coolamore, Callan, Kilkenny. Timothy Doran and Margaret Walsh married on the 23rd of January, 1834, and had 7 children. Mary, born in 1835, Anastasia, born in 1837, William in 1839, Patrick, 1841, John, 1844, Catherine, 1846, and Johanna, born in 1849. Here is the interment in French of the youngest Doran child, Johanna, in Quebec. This indicates that the family traveled to Quebec in the 17 months between her birth on the 17th of May, 1849, and her death on the 17th of July, 1850. Also is the interment in French of Timothy Doran on the 1st of January, 1851. The 2 interments were recorded in Notre Dame before St. Patrick's Church was formally recognized as a sanctuary in 1853. The death of Timothy left the family in dire straits with no breadwinner. Margaret was never recorded in Quebec, so we do not know what happened to her. 4 of the Doran children were listed in the 1851 census of Canada, living on Champlain Street with other Irish Catholic families. There were 621 census returns for households on Champlain Street. Most were from Ireland and Roman Catholic. A random sample of 20 households was investigated. 18 were Roman Catholic, 2 Protestant. All 20 heads of household were born in Ireland. Occupations from this sample included boat builder, timber tower, sawyer, laborer, butcher, clerk, and joiner. The census forms were printed in English, whereas other parts of the city were in French. Nearly 1/3 of known Irish immigrants to Quebec City were from Cork, Kilkenny, Limerick, and Wexford. Thus, approximately 1/4 of immigrants chose Canada. Orphans were not only taken in by French-Canadian families, many were sent to live with relatives already in North America, Canada, or the United States, or with other Irish families, as with the Doran children. Hundreds of Quebec families adopted more than 2,000 Irish orphans, encouraging them to keep their Irish names. Here, on the 1851 census, we find Mary and John Doran living with the Wallace family. John listed as an orphan at age 7, and Mary as a servant at age 16. Here we have William Doran, the eldest son of the family, listed as an orphan at age 12, living with the Haberlin family. Here is Patrick living with the Ferguson family. James Ferguson, the head of the family, was a boat builder, and Patrick was listed as an apprentice at age 8. This is the marriage of William to Carolyn Worrell, and it's the first record that we find for the Doran family in St. Patrick's Church. And you can see it was written in English as opposed to the French. Some common Clare names in the 1851 Quebec census were Breen, Casey, Glynn, Kelly, Mangan, McNamara, O'Brien, and O'Connor. Here we see the 1851 census listing Clare. This was the McNamaras. And here were the O'Connor family listed as being place of birth is County Clare. And here are some others listed with County Clare and Kilrush. You can see there's a Michael and Catherine Huck up in the top right-hand corner. Catherine lists as being born in Kilrush, as well as the Lane family. She lists herself as being born in Kilrush as well. Unfortunately, I had a bit of technical difficulty with my presentation. It didn't go into all the slides that I had with some of the Clare folks, but I will continue to read this for you. Catherine Huck recorded her birth in Kilrush in the 1851 Census of Canada. I found Catherine's maiden name on her daughter Mary's baptismal record in 1853. In the Kilrush parish records of 1827 to 1863, there is only one Catherine Enright listed, born in 1843. I do not believe this would be the same person, as she would only have been 10 years old when her first child was born. As her husband had stated he was born in Limerick, I wonder if Catherine might have been born in Kilrush, Limerick. I was not able to ascertain their marriage record. The only other person who had said they were born in Kilrush in the 1851 Census of Canada was Elizabeth Lane, age 28, wife of Thomas Lane, age 38, born in Limerick. This record also shows 6 children, all being born in Quebec from 1843. This indicates the couple migrated before 1843. I discovered Elizabeth's maiden name, Mangan, on their son John's baptismal record in 1843 in Notre Dame Cathedral. I then found a baptismal record for Stephen Lane, baptized on 14th of December, 1841 at St. Michael's Church in Limerick City. I then found an interment record for young Stephen at Notre Dame Basilica in Quebec, February of 1843. This confirms the couple migrated to Quebec in the 14 months between Stephen's baptism and his burial, similar to that of my own family. The obituary for Elizabeth Mangan from the Morning Chronicle and Commercial and Shipping Gazette states that she was a native of Kilrush, County Clare. And I do have a photograph of her headstone that lists her as being a native of Kilrush, County Clare. Unfortunately, as many of you know, St. Senan's Parish baptismal records are not available before 1827, so I was not able to find a baptismal record for her. I also looked for her marriage record in Kilrush and Limerick, but could not find one. A couple pieces of interesting information I found while researching Elizabeth Mangan. On her husband's baptismal record, it states one of the sponsors was a Mary Mangan. Could that have been a family connection to Elizabeth's family? And secondly, her mother-in-law's obituary states that she is from Ballyhay in County Clare. I was unable to find such a place in Clare. Could it have meant to be Ballya? Am I pronouncing that correctly? There are 3 Ballyas in Clare, near Ennis, near Liscannor, and one near Ina. Or could it have meant Ballyhaig in Kerry? Of course, we know that with accents and the way words are written, there's a lot of confusion at times. I will leave you with this very poignant poem, The Emigrant Ship. The author signed it with the initials JAB. It was printed in the Ballymena Observer on Saturday, 26th of September in 1857. The day was clear and the wind fair, while on the flowing tide, a gallant ship with sails unfurled, proudly was seen to ride, many upon her noble deck, for friends and country sighed. Fate drove them from their dear old homes, from where they loved to dwell. It tore them from their native land, the land they loved so well. To kindred, friends, to the immigrants were forced to bid farewell. Adieu, they cried, to fatherland, to all in life most dear. And when they caught the shore's last glimpse, they shed a parting tear. Parting tears shed for home and friends, what bitter tears they were. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary Alice. I'm going to play around with the microphones here because...
And I must apologize. My slideshow, the correct slideshow did not come up. It came up with an older presentation, so it didn't match up with my narration. So I do apologize.
I'm now going to mute. I'm going to appear to those watching on YouTube. And we have 2 microphones now for anyone who wants to ask questions from the audience here in the room. And if those watching on YouTube want to ask us questions, you can just type it in the chat. Any questions for Mary Alice? Can we, John, would you take the microphones down, please? This one is so that the people in the room can hear you, and this one is so the people on YouTube can hear you.
Are they good? Yeah, perfect. This one.
Both of them.
Both of them, yeah.
Thank you, Mary Alice. There was a lot of research, obviously.
Yes.
So, yeah, would you know any more as to why there was such a big difference as to the cost of the trip between going to the States and going to Canada?
Because Canada and Ireland were both British colonies, so it was considered going to within the same country, whereas going to the United States was considered a different country.
So who was funding those ships? Who was behind the ships? And
Well, the ships, there was a huge timber industry in Canada, and there was a lack of timber in Great Britain. As my grandfather used to say, because Henry VIII cut all the trees down. So ships were always coming over this way, bringing timber, because there was a market here and they needed the timber. So then the ships, when they were going back empty until they decided, they saw that there was a need for a market for people that wanted to leave Ireland and England and Scotland. So it just made to be a perfect storm for people to go back on. The ships were privately owned by people in Canada.
so I know in the Jeannie Johnson, there was a doctor on board, and so there wasn't any deaths.
Right.
And but we saw horrific numbers of deaths. So were doctors on board those ships? Would you know? Did you come across that?
It's not something that I have come across, but there was so much disease, cholera and typhus, that they couldn't keep it away. I have been on the Jenny Johnson when it was in Rhode Island years ago. I've not been on it since living here, but I know that was quite an amazing voyage not to have anyone sick.
And in relation to the nuns and the treatment of what was termed orphans, were you able to come across any particular stories that you could share with us?
In my research, I have, but not that I would remember off the top of my head. But I appreciate that question, and it is something that I will try to incorporate the next time I give this.
Thank you.
Clare.
Just in relation to the people who were assisted, in inverted commas, was it always assistance, or was it clearing and reclaiming the land by the landlords?
Oh, a lot of it was.
Yeah.
Clearing and the Strokestown Estate Park, Strokestown Estate scheme, we know that they were clearing the land. And there may be some controversy. I'm going by what I have learned.
Okay, because I think in Lisa Delhouse, which was Countess Markovich, I think her father or grandfather was involved in some assistance scheme, and there was a huge one up in Belmullet.
Okay, I'm not familiar with.
But they have a little museum in Blacksod or Belmullet. There was a small museum dedicated to the immigrants, and a lot of them had gone
Right.
on assistance schemes. And some of them then, I think, they lived in very poor conditions, working for farmers maybe, or...
Right,
Yeah.
right. I mean, it was not a pleasant time for people. And as I had a quote I had there, and I can't go back and put my finger on it, but, you know, they were clearing the land, so to speak. They were clearing the people out, a lot of them, not
Not
everywhere,
everybody.
but we do know a lot of that happened.
Thank you.
And if I may just add to that, I think to some degree, I believe that there were some managers, maybe not landowners, but managers that felt they were doing the right thing because the people here were in such poor condition that they thought, they believed in their hearts, and this is not everybody, that they were sending people off to have a better life because they weren't having a good life here at that time. But again, that's not everyone. I mean, some of them were just outright getting rid of people to take the land back.
Thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions here in the room? Brian Comerford, can you pass the mic over to Brian there? The mic.
It's some time back now, but I can recall that the Board of Guardians in Kilrush discussed a scheme whereby what they described as female paupers of childbearing age and younger were sent to Australia.
Right, I've heard of that. And as a matter of fact, a woman that was in my program at the time I was at UL was doing her master's on that. But it's not anything I'm familiar with.
Noel Kilkenny has a question here in the front.
Thank you very much, Mary Alice, for your presentation. The focus on Canada is fresh, and I think we've all taken it for granted, most of us, to the United States. On the question of assisted passage, I grew up in, let's say in the 70s, I grew up earlier, but in the 70s, an apologist for the Vandaleurs here said, oh, they were very good. They paid for 600 people from this town to go to Canada, and they sent an agent to look after them until they all got work. Now, I've never, ever found any evidence to that, but that was somebody saying, oh, they weren't all bad, you know. I'm not convinced. In terms of the Irish in Canada, up to the 70s, Toronto was still very much a Protestant city. The Orange Order was then, and still is to some extent, active in the city. It was an unwelcome place for Catholics, and certainly the Irish who went on from Quebec to Toronto didn't get an easy welcome, as I understand it. But there are two people I'd like to mention in particular. Way back in sometime in the 60s or early 70s, the Prime Minister of Quebec was Claude Ryan, clearly one of the ones who didn't travel on. And of course, we've got Brian Mulrooney, who was very proud of his Irish background, although born in a French Quebec town.
I've met him.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, likewise. So I think when you go to Canada, all the young Irish people go to Canada now, they love Toronto, they love Vancouver. You don't hear of anybody really going to Quebec except for tourism purposes. But I think that there is certainly value to further research what actually went on.
Yes.
One question, because I think your family, you said, came from Bangor, Maine. Senator Mitchell
Yes.
of the peace process, of course, is from Maine and from
Yep.
Bangor. I don't know how his family reached there. It could have been through Canada. His name, of course, their name wasn't Mitchell at all. Their name was Kilroy. And his father was orphaned and adopted by a Lebanese Christian family who'd anglicized their name to Mitchell.
Yes.
Anyway, so
Yes.
good luck in your further research.
My mother's best friend knows him very well. He's a good man. But yes, my family came down from Quebec to Bangor, and we still have relatives. I still have cousins that live in Bangor. So.
One final thing, of course, Senator Mitchell is famous for one quote, which I've always think is wonderful. He spent 400 days in Northern Ireland. He said, I had 399 days of failure, 1 day of success.
That's
Thank
all
you.
you need.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have we any more questions here in the room, or will I move on to the online? Somebody down the back? No? Maybe I'll move on and read out some of the questions that have come in. John, can you pass me back the wireless mic?
Yep.
Just to make sure that those listening to us online can hear me. We have a long string. We have how many people now online? 29 watching us online. So they've been firing loads of questions up here on YouTube, which I will throw at Mary Alice. We'll go back. Aileen Wynn watching us from Trim says, many thanks for a great talk, Mary Alice. Are the records from the Gross Eel Cemetery available? Are they online anywhere?
Yes, they are. Gross Eel has their own website with records available.
And Rosemary Killeen says her Irish-born great-great-grandparents named MacKnight were tailors, recorded the birth and baptism of their first son at the Catholic Church in Kingston, Ontario in 1849. She suspects they migrated through Quebec to Kingston, probably in the years prior to 1849, potentially from Limerick. Where can I look for records of their immigration?
Oh. There is a lack of records between Ireland and Quebec, I believe, until it was into the 1860s, 1864, before they were required to keep ships' records. So I believe your best bet would be to go off birth and death records between here and there, and who you find born here. And this is one of the links doesn't always connect up, as we've had with our family, because you don't have that immigration record other than, you know, when somebody was born here or married here, and then all of a sudden they show up in Canada on the next record. So
it's the sad ones where the child was born here and died on the other side within a year or two that tell you the date of immigration.
Horrible.
Ed O'Shaughnessy from Washington State, I think, tells us the record of ships sailing from Limerick is documented, but unfortunately passenger manifests do not seem to exist. So he's answering Rosemary's question.
Right.
Tony Brown in Limerick is asking, did you ever hear of Francis Spate, who brought many from Limerick? A son-in-law of James Patterson, a name that will be familiar to many of our Kilrush audience.
Yeah. I was not familiar with that name until this evening. As a matter of fact, Patty had mentioned it to me, and it will be something that I'll be doing some more research on.
Good, and we're hoping to have maybe Arlene White from Killaloe come and give her talk on Francis Spate over the next year or so. And some of you might have seen there was a book launched in Listowel on Friday night, The Final Voyage of the Thetis by Paul O'Dowd. The wreck of the Thetis can still be seen submerged in the sand on Bale Strand across the river. It was one of Francis Spate's ships. His next ship he also called the Thetis. And one of his early ships he called after himself, the Francis Spate. And it was dismasted and drifted for weeks in the mid-Atlantic, and the crew turned to cannibalism. And I think a man called Gorman from Kilrush was one of the victims. And then he called his next ship after himself again, another Francis Spate. So, the story was that he was making great money importing timber from Canada, and he was sending back ships empty. And he said, what sort of cargo can I put in? He had bought an encumbered estate over in Tipperary near Ballina called Derry Castle, and he started shipping out the tenants off his estate as ballast on the timber ships going back for their next cargo. So a man with a mixed reputation, I think. Tony Brown, I'm sure, knows loads about Francis Spate himself. Deirdre Ryan, coming back to the story about Lissadell and Constance Markievicz, tells us it was her grandfather, Sir Jocelyn Gore Booth, who provided a cow on each of the 3 boats and received letters back from the emigrants on their arrival in New Brunswick in Canada. So that's an answer rather than a question. Lloyd Hunt says, a messy question. I have heard that up to 30% died on the ships before the Safe Passage Act received the attention from De Vere and others. Were the bodies overboard as lost at sea or kept for burial? Well, I think you told us if they died more than 30 kilometers offshore, they went
Right.
overboard.
Right.
And then there's As with these conversations, the messages get interspersed when they're too long. Back to the Markovich-Lissadell question, he probably wanted to clear the small holdings, but he also financed a lot of single people. Most of the Lissadell immigrants ended up in the States. And Lloyd says many people went from Montreal to Toronto as a result of Bill 101 under Robert Bourassa, with great regret as they loved Montreal. Of course, Quebec and Ontario were more or less independent until 1867, was it, with Confederation in Canada. Karen Seredinsky from Quebec, who was here in Kilrush a few weeks ago, says there are numerous Quebecers today with Irish surnames who speak zero English. And Linda B says, given the huge cost difference in traveling to Canada compared to the United States, she's surprised the numbers were so much higher going to the US. Well, I think a lot of us are surprised they were so much higher going to Canada, because we don't hear so much about Canadian immigration anymore.
No, we don't. We don't. I think the US had the promise of a better life. My interpretation, Canada then was a British colony, as was Ireland. So whether the thinking was they wanted to get away from this life completely and go to the States, I think some of it too had to do with where previous cousins and family went. And if they'd already gone to the States for one reason or another, then they would follow along and go to the States. Or if they'd gone to Canada, they would go follow on to Canada. I think with some of the schemes, they would go to Canada because it was cheaper and the landlords just wanted to get them out. But then we also know so many of them went from Canada, there was no border crossing at the time. So they just walked down the road and crossed into another country and could find work and then settle in the States.
And our secretary, Paul O'Brien, is watching at home and looking up the newspaper archives in another window, and has found an article from 1855 on Irish immigration to Canada, which says the following announcement appears in the Clare Journal of yesterday. Town Councillor Armitage of Kingston, Canada, late of Kilrush, is appointed with others by the Canadian government to visit Ireland and hold meetings for the purpose of showing the resources of the Canadas and to encourage immigration. Anyone know anything about Armitage of Kingston and Kilrush? Another follow-up research project for you. And Ed O'Shaughnessy has come back and encouraged us to read an article in the Other Clare, volume 47, on emigration from Limerick to Quebec and Montreal in Black 47. Not sure, is that Ed's own article? He's done many articles on the Vandeleur evictions and other things for the Other Clare. And I think that's all the questions for Mary Alice in the online. Karen Zindinsky says that Bill 101 was René Levesque's doing. Do we know who he was? Any more questions in the room before we wrap up? Colette has one more question. You want to pass the mic down again, John?
Sorry, very brief. Is it correct that the ports of entry were Ellis Island, Gros Isle, and then New Orleans in terms of numbers?
Well, it depends on the time frame. Ellis Island was not until 1892. And before that, for New York, it was Castle Garden. In terms of ports of emigration, ships would land wherever they could land and let people off, because there were so many ships going. So they could land in, they could go to Bangor, Maine. They could go to Quebec. They could go to Boston, New York, New Orleans. They could land in Falmouth, Maine. Has anyone ever heard of Falmouth, Maine? It's just a town north of Portland that was on the shore.
Okay.
So it really was wherever a ship could land, wherever the water was deep enough,
Thanks, Mary Alice.
Sure.
Really enjoyed the talk.
And I apologize for not having more information on Clare, but when I was doing my master's degree, in writing my dissertation, my interest was where my ancestors went from Kilkenny to Quebec. And when I was preparing to do this presentation, there just weren't many from Clare that went to Quebec during the famine times. So that's why I tried to find as much as I could, but there just wasn't, and I just don't have the, I have not done a lot of research with where Clare Kilrush people, maybe now that I live here, maybe that will be another project for me, going.
So Mary Alice, what
Yes.
were the ports of call then in Ireland for those ships then?
There were a lot. I mean, Waterford, Wexford.
So
Cork,
from here,
Limerick.
people would have had to have got down to Limerick then.
No,
Not necessarily.
ships
Some would have
here
gone
at
from
Edinburgh.
Oh, yeah,
Kilrush.
some went from Kappa, didn't they? Yeah, some went from Kappa. Yeah. Again, I think it probably was anywhere a ship could get to land.
They will really go from Kappa.
Yeah.
Mohammed
As the ships got bigger, they needed deeper water ports to sail from. So that's why in the earlier days, they went from small ports all over the place. In later
Right.
times, the bigger ships went from Cove. and
Yeah, I
really
hadn't
big
come
ports.
across so many going to Canada. So that from here. And I just wondered, just in terms of the number of Clare, when you were going through the names and relating that to counties, I was just wondering if that related to the fact that there were more ships going to the States from Clare.
I don't know. I don't know. Or they could have been going to other parts of Canada, not necessarily going to Quebec. So a lot of people went to New Brunswick, which was actually, it would have been a little bit shorter of a sailing rather than going down the St. Lawrence River and around. So I think maybe they went to Canada, just to different parts of Canada than what I have studied.
And then maybe travel down to the States because that was the cheaper way of doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Lots of chatter going on YouTube. I think we'll probably wind it up at this stage. So thank you very much again, Mary Alice, for a great talk. And before we go, a few reminders both for our audience here and remotely. Lisa, our chairperson down at the back, is waving our new calendar hot off the presses. I collected it from the printers on my way here this evening. €10 plus shipping. Those of you watching on YouTube can send us an email or a Facebook message if you'd like to order. This is what, about our 13th or 14th consecutive year producing a Kilrush Down Memory Lane calendar. And our next talk will be the 26th of November here in the Chockkiol and on YouTube, if the technology is still working. And it's by Pádraig Óg O'Rourke, a noted historian of the War of Independence period, who we've had here before. And it's on the forced disappearances in Ireland, 1916 to 2016. So he's moved on to more recent history after starting out in the 1916 period. So we look forward to having Pádraig back and to seeing you all here again in 4 weeks' time. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you all for watching on YouTube.
Thank you.
And goodbye to those watching online. We will end the stream now.